Paul M. Kennedy is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History and Distinguished Fellow of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy at Yale University. He served as the Director of International Security Studies from 1989 until 2017, and he is now the Director of the Maritime and Naval Studies Initiative. A native of Northern England, Professor Kennedy obtained his BA at Newcastle University and his DPhil at the University of Oxford. He holds many honorary degrees and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was made Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2000 for services to history and elected a Fellow of the British Academy in June 2003. He is the author or editor of 19 books, including The Rise of the Anglo-German Antagonism, Engineers of Victory, The Problem Solvers Who Turned the Tide in the Second World War, and of course, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. He just recently submitted the completed manuscript of Victory at Sea to Yale University Press, and perhaps I'm hoping he'll tell us a little bit about it this evening. It is my great privilege, and I'm very grateful that Professor Kennedy has made the trip down here from New Haven to be with us this evening. Sir, please.
John Hall, members of the committee, members of the society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly honored to be here. I just was so touched that you and your committee chose to invite me to give this address. The last time I think John and I came to be on a panel or something like that at the Society, after I finished my remarks, I looked up and I saw the glint and smile of that unmistakable face of Dennis Showalter in the second row, a wonderful friend of mine. I'm delighted that John Sumida can be looking in this afternoon. And I realized that as I was heading to LaGuardia Airport yesterday in the middle of the day, the last time I'd headed to an airport was 15 months earlier to fly to London to the memorial service for Sir Michael Howard in the wonderful King's College Chapel at King's, with the Coldstream God trumpeter greeting us. I'm sure Michael Howard would have much enjoyed, maybe still is wandering around somewhere up there, looking down on us and approving of what we are doing, the study of military history and all of its many aspects. I'm going to talk a little this afternoon, but I'll try to get you to keep clicking forward so we get through the slides I offered. Talk a little about not just a book that I finished and John mentioned on Victory at Sea, which has got the subtitle Maritime Conflict and the Shift in World Power, 1936 to 1946. But also about some thoughts I've been giving as to how military history and naval history and the stuff that we do might also be linked to some other large schools of political science and of statistical history, and indeed of Brodell's three-layer history of historical change in his book on Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world of Philip II. So the title of the front cover of this book looks something like this. John, if you can click on it. Although I have my own maritime. Yes, put the slides up, please. Otherwise, I really will be waving around here and saying, if you can only imagine what the sinking of a Bismarck looks like. Well, there it is. This work it took quite a long time in doing, John, as many of us have works which take a long time in doing. This was one triggered by the fact that I was going to get 2 hip replacements a few years ago and agreed that in the easy relaxation that you have after hip replacements, I could write the foreword to a collection of wonderful marine paintings by the wonderful Ian Marshall. That agreement to write just the foreword slid, as things do, to writing a simple text for a book on the warships of the Second World War and victory at sea. And then when Ian unfortunately passed away, it slipped to be something else. This is the great marine artist, Ian Marshall. This is the next slide, showing some of the brand new paintings which are going to be in this book from the war in the Pacific, the war in the Mediterranean, and in the Atlantic convoys. The book itself looks, and in its first conception, was rather like a typical naval account of actions in the Second World War, and relied heavily upon 2 works, one of which was mentioned by John Sumida, so this is in the next slide, the official histories by Stephen Ruskell, and the 15-volume Samuel Eliot Morison History of the United States Naval Operations in the Second World War. But after a while, as I began to put this together, I wondered if it was possible. And what I've done in this book is something which the French call a tentative. It is something which you offer tentatively, like, does this work? If it doesn't, well, my publisher will not allow me to pull it off the bookshelves, but you know what I mean. The tentative was to ask whether I could link a history of naval operations in the Second World War to schools of historical analysis and causation. And one of the schools, while historically based, is indeed one of political scientists, which I'll explain to in a minute. But the first of those was by a historian who, here we go with Braudel, really influenced me when I was doing my graduate work, or coming out of my graduate work at Oxford. Braudel's magnificent volume, if it's on the slide, I hope it is, of the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world of Philip II, and his subsequent volumes to that, because in it, and in some essays, he thought that you could describe the analysis of history and causality of history as existing at 3 layers. He had this kind of geological sense of history. And the 3 layers were that at the bottom layer in the Mediterranean, which was very similar north and south and east and west, it was affected by climate, it was affected by distance. It hardly altered, but above that lower level came a level of gradual shifts in trade and technology, which had an impact on the Mediterranean world and brought it later on to its end into the Atlantic world. And then above it was what he and the school called the history of events, which is why we tried to put together this kind of model, the 3-level or the sort of pyramid of Braudelian way you might look at the history of the Battle of the Atlantic. That is to say, there is the environment, the distances, the pack ice in the winter time, the enormous storms which cross it, the trade routes and the ports in which, thank heavens for the Allied war effort, one had New York and Halifax on one side, and Glasgow and Liverpool, and Belfast on the other side. The middle level was shifting technologies of the Second World War, shifting size of the escorts, socioeconomic and power trends, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And it's at the top of Braudel's 3 levels that you had what he calls l'histoire événement, the history of events. They mattered, of course. The pedestal convoy, the Channel Dash, the sinking of the Bismarck, but they were the history of events, and something else was happening. And it behooved naval historians to try to understand some of the backdrop of that. Many naval historians do. So while the history of events is scarred in our memory because of so many wonderful things which happen and challenges which happen. I thought I'd toss in that first edition of Montserrat's The Cruel Sea, John in his wonderful novel, because The Cruel Sea, that story of a little compass rose, a little flower class corvette, ends in the middle of the war, and he ends with a wonderful sort of paragraph or two where he says, this is by 1943, the compass rose was being taken over, but there were much more powerful escorts. There were larger things like frigates and sloops and Captain Johnny Walker's combinations of warships which would go out and sink a lot of the German U-boats. But the first part of the war was, for those fighting the cruel sea, an extraordinary one of challenge. So could one talk about the war, Second World War, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, but in the Atlantic as one of being of three levels of analysis? I thought so. At least I was going to try. Remember, it is a tentative. The other tentative is even more risky, and I'm rather glad I'm not with some of my more cynical and traditional Yale history colleagues, but it was to say, could we do something with that array of literature in the field of political science, John, which is long cycle theory and hegemonic war theory, of which the first most significant of those was Modelsky's long cycles in world politics. Could you take a look at what are called Kondratiev waves, 75, 85-year long cycles of production and shifts in world technologies and economic major cycles, and put them into a story of the war at sea and the history of sea nations over time? One of Modelsky's associates, William Thompson, came together with him and produced this next work, Sea Power and Global Politics. I do not recommend it if your history of naval warfare and naval events is where you like it to be now. This one is the most statistically laden political science, IR theory, intense work. I throw at you I think the doors are locked, so you kind of get out. I throw at you one of Modelsky's long cycles as the next slide. The intriguing thing about this, though, is that these folks are trying to look at the history of sea empires, maritime empires, but put them in regard to long cycles in economics. But what they do show, what Modelsky and Thompson do show, is that remarkable final surge in their statistical analysis of the naval power of the United States as it comes through in the Second World War. And it is that which I thought was intriguing enough to try to follow. But to just reassure you for the next minute or two, John, I'm going to tell the story of two warships on a journey in May 1943. The first of these is an improved British First World War destroyer, HMS Vedette. It is in its modification coming through the Atlantic on the famous convoy I'm going to mention. And the second is in exactly the same month, in a different ocean, a different type of warship, sailing also to the west, the USS Essex, demonstrating how many aircraft, the big punch of 96 aircraft it can carry, as it heads from this harbor, from this port, out to the Panama Canal and across the Pacific to join Nimitz, arriving on the glorious 1st of June, 1943, just as Vedette was arriving almost exhausted in Halifax at the end of May 1943. Why do I go for these two? Well, let's look at Essex first of all. We often forget, next slide, we often forget that by the first half of 1943, Halsey had only one single carrier in the Pacific. 1943 wasn't a very decisive year for carrier warfare in the Pacific because we didn't have any carriers. All of the early ones had gone. The Lexington, the Yorktown, the Wasp, the Hornet, Intrepid was being renovated. Ranger wasn't used for the long distances in the Pacific. Again, the Braudelian distancing affecting things. Lexington was being repaired. And so it always makes me shake my head to discover that in May 1943, another May 1943, Saratoga was joined by a second aircraft carrier for operations down in Southwest Pacific. And it was an aircraft carrier called USS Robin. Now, of course, it was not USS Robin. It was a Victorious, a brand new Victorious, loaned by the Admiralty, given the code name, the radio name of Robin. They work together, the Fleet Air Arm and the US Navy, until the story comes back again to the Essex, because it's a month after Victorious is sent to return home and return her US naval aircraft that the Essex arrives at Newport News, or from Newport News to the Pacific. So I've indulged in giving a photograph of the Essex. There is the Essex, and the next one, we'll start moving quickly. I think there is the combination which wins the Battle of the Pacific in 1943 onwards. The Hellcat and the Essex-class carriers, of which we built 22. The first carrier came into the Pearl Harbor, as I just said, in June 1943. The next carrier came, John, in July 1943. The next one came in the middle of July 1943. The next one, a light fleet carrier in August 1943. By the end of 1943, we had sent 10 carriers to the Pacific. So something else is happening underneath this story of the history of events. Something else is happening underneath this story of why the Hellcat is the most successful fighter and fighter-bomber of the Second World War in the Pacific. Something else is happening, which I tried to deal with in the book. I will just tantalize you, especially those of you who are getting quite hungry, by showing what I made up, which is my next slide. It's called the sausage chain. It actually is the 10 stages in the development of the victory machine of the Great Marianas turkey hunt. Why did the Great Marianas turkey hunt become so decisive a victory? It was because of those Essex-class carriers and those Grumman fighters. Where did they come from? The great turkey shoot, if you go back and strip it off a little, comes from the Essex. On top of the Essex is the Hellcat. The Hellcat is produced at the Grumman factory in Long Island. The engines for the Hellcat come from Connecticut, the Pratt & Whitney factory. The aluminum for much of the Hellcat comes from the Alcoa refinery of down in Tennessee. The barges bring up the bauxite from across the Caribbean, protected by Royal Navy destroyers, because Admiral King did not believe in escorts, of course. The ore carriers go to ports in northern South America to get the bauxite. The US Marines protect those bauxite mines before we're even in the Second World War. Something is going on. Meanwhile, the other story I tell with the Vedette is this one, the critical convoy battle of May 1943. The one coming out of Liverpool with empty vessels going back to be refueled if they're oil tankers, filled up if they are, other sorts of general store ships. And in that battle, Dönitz throws no less than 43 U-boats in 3 U-boat packs. They are defeated decisively by this sort of small ship, vidette. If we go on to, again, the photograph is shown again, the vidette, and it's, John Samida, I think, would like this, it's the Admiralty report of the vidette, and it's 4 or 5 narrow escorting vessels around the convoy ONS-5 coming off through the mists of the Newfoundland banks on May the 5th and 6th of 1943, reads something like this. I cannot read it out all the time now, but I think you can see what I'm getting at, John. At 23:09, the vidette made a radar contact at 5,100 yards. It dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges. It did sink the U-531. The Loosestrife made a radar contact just an hour later. At 4, this is 4 in the morning, vidette in the middle of the mist, in the middle of the dark, made an ASDIC contact. At 5:52, the Pelican detected a radar contact and sank another. Dönitz lost 5 submarines in 6 hours and 3 more badly damaged. The new technology, the middle level of a Brodelian approach to this story, is this thing, the next slide, please, John, the cavity magnetron radar, the miniaturized radar, which had been produced by those folks at the University of Birmingham in 1940 and brought across to be developed by Bell Technologies in 1942-43, and then redistributed to all of our patrol aircraft and also all of our small warships to get at the U-boats, so that by 1943, in the Battle of the Atlantic, as it turns so swiftly between the convoy losses of March 1943 and the absolute sweeping victories after June 1943, above them at last are the patrol aircraft. Patrol aircraft, however, who now look like, you know, like some sort of radio signal operating all the way over. Look at the Wellington bomber with all of its new antennae, which it did not have there 15 months earlier. Look at the very long-range Liberator, which comes to join escorts like Vidette only a month later. So that the results are like this. Again, I doff my hat to John Samida for teaching me a lot about using statistics and telling a naval story. This is 1943 in the Atlantic. These are the U-boat losses on the one hand. See how they go up and up and up. And the merchant ship losses on the other hand. Something transformative happens in the year 1943, and it can be explained by the fight of the cruel sea type small ships and aircraft carriers. Something else is at work. U-boat losses go up throughout the war year by year, as this bland statistic now shows, this one here, John. And as the U-boat losses are going up in one ocean of the globe, something else is happening in the other ocean of the globe, which is this one. The power shift of 1943 in the Pacific, and the production story in the Pacific. Where on earth do all of these come from? I'm going to tantalize you with 2 or 3 more statistical tables, and then collapse on the floor, not quite sure whether it is the broken toes of my left foot or the return of my childhood polio on the right foot, which will, you know, I forget what Lady Whatnot said, Lady Brantwell, if you lose one parent, you're careless. If you manage to lose both parents, you're really very, very stupid. Well, I am, never mind. Here is the surge of the aircraft, of the aircraft carrier production. What is behind that surge, so that by the time we're going to be operating off the Japanese coast in 1945, By the time we're planning Operation Downfall, we are thinking that we will have no less than 44 aircraft carriers and 23 battleships. That's only 2 years after 1943. Where does all this come from? John, the next slide, please. US total aircraft production. Can you go back to, if it's there? There, total aircraft production. 19,000 aircraft in 1941, still behind the German and the British and the Soviet totals. 1942, 41,000 planes. 1943, ladies and gentlemen, once again, hammer it in, Kennedy. 1943, 85,900 aircraft, many of which are heavies. They're enormous big aircraft which take the resources and the personnel of 10 times what a Messerschmitt 110 takes. And this is something we put together for the book, and I'm rather intrigued by and wanted to know if you will also be intrigued at this one. This is overall warship tonnages of the 6 naval powers which were there in 1936 and are not there in 1946. That is the essence of my book. In 1936, in the story of navies, there's a multipolar naval world. By 1946, there is not a multipolar naval world. In 1943, this enormous transformation of the world takes place. When do hegemonic powers shift? Is the next slide I had, just to remind me of where I'm going. Look at this. This is armaments production. If there's one single statistic out of all of this, it is what happens to the armaments production of this country, United States, between 1941 and 1943, such that there is nothing which can stand in its way. Churchill was right. If you can only get the Americans in, and you can get that giant boiler lit underneath. Remember, he goes to bed at the end of the day in which he's heard of the attacks on Hong Kong, the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and he goes to bed and says, so we had won the war after all. We had won the war after all because the Americans were coming in, because he meant this enormous productive machine was coming in. So when do great power shifts occur? I come back to the history of narrative, and then I come back to my final conclusion. That great historian, one of my wonderful favorite female military historians, Wedgwood, C.V. Wedgwood, asks close to the end of her magnificent book, The 30 Years' War, when she describes the defeat at last after 80 years of fighting of the proud Spanish infantry at Rocroi. She says that this, I'm not going to read it out to you because time charges, but I leave it to you to think about it. In the center of the position on the fields before Rocroi, there stands a little modern monument, an unassuming gray monolith, the gravestone of Spanish army, one might say the gravestone of Spanish greatness. I like that phrase. And the next slide is my modern gravestones compared with something else which happens differently. That is to say, these two. The gravestone of Dönitz's ambitions, all surrendering at Iceland, at Loch Swilly in Northern Ireland, across the North Sea, and the triumph of American naval supremacy, both of these captured in wonderful paintings by Ian Marshall, where I started my story and my explanation many, many years ago. This is the history of sea power as it is represented by overall warship tonnages over a 30-year period where great hegemonic shifts occurred. So I'm going to leave you with these. Last statistical slide, John, please. There it is nothing like this happened in all of transformative military naval history than this one. And so I conclude that Modelsky and Thompson were right. That is what I put up in the writing on my penultimate slide. Here we go. They were right. A global transformation had taken place. A hegemonic outcome had occurred. Only there had been more to this story than the simple study of long cycles in history. This is what historians bring to the study of it all. This is what historians bring to the story of world power transitions. So I leave you with, my publishers will be very pleased at this, I leave you with one final slide, which is once again, victory at sea, maritime struggle and a shift in the global order. I'm so thrilled and honored to have been able to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much indeed, John. Thank you all, Pete.